in terms of the landscape where we live at, that plays a role in what we're exposed to. You look over here in the top left corner, Vermilion, South Dakota. I had an opportunity to travel there. I was speaking at University of South Dakota, their legal department. And as you see, it's 87% white. So when I got off that plane, it was just me and the black person taking the bags off the plane. There was only 2 black people in Vermilion, South Dakota, right? And then when I get to the township of Vermilion, I could tell that the only real interaction that they may have had with black people was probably what they seen on Fox News, right? But then in terms of like entrepreneurship, I was thinking in the back of my mind, like, yo, I could probably start a business here and just people pay me to take pictures with a real black person. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, that's the kind of environment that it was, right? So now you think about children who grow up in an environment like that. Usually they're not going to see me every day, right? And if they're watching Fox News all of the time or some of these, you know, extremely violent or sexist videos, they're going to think that I'm a certain way as well, right? But as parents living in a community, parents and guardians have to take another step and be more intentional about exposing children to cultural diversity because it's not really around you at all. You know, you can do that intellectually by exposing children to literature and programming that's appropriate, that gives you an accurate account and perspective of other people from other places. And you can take your children places to see different things. But usually that's not the reality for a lot of families where we live at, right? A lot of families are very siloed and very disconnected from the world, right? And unfortunately, children that grow up in environments like that without that type of cultural exposure or diversity have a very slanted view of the human family. And then you can see the same thing in Lithonia, Georgia. That's a possibility. Because if you go there, it's mostly black folks in Lithonia, Georgia, right? And if you just grow up in that environment where everybody that you see in your community looks the same, everybody in your schools look the same, the business owners and everybody looks the same, you might have some slanted views about people from Vermilion, South Dakota. So parents in that environment also have to be intentional about taking their children places and exposing them to cultural enrichment so that they have more of a well-rounded perspective of our human family. When you look at New York, that's much more diverse, right? How many people has been in New York City? I remember one time I was walking around in New York City and I felt myself frowning for no reason. I'm just walking down the street and I felt and I'm like, why am I mad? You know, but it was just the environment itself, right? But if you grow up in New York City, you're likely to come in contact with different people from different places, right? Next slide, please. But if you look at Toronto, Toronto's similar to a New York City. It definitely smells better. But you grow up in environments in Toronto where the children, you know the difference between a person that's Filipino and a person that is from Burma, from a person that's from Japan, from South Korea. You know those distinctions because you're living in an environment where you're exposed to that. But if you don't have that type of environment, you might just think everybody's Asian and just mistake people for who they are and their cultural heritage. So you see the same kind of dynamic even on the Canadian side, where if you went to Burnaby, British Columbia, you see 37% people who are classified as white. You have more of a Asian community of Chinese, South Asian, Filipino, Korean. So a person born in that environment, they're going to be exposed to different things in terms of cultural perspective that under other circumstances they wouldn't have access to. So that's just right around them in an environment, right? Every time I come through here, like for these speaking engagements, I'm going to be honest, I'm not really comfortable because this does not look like my community. And this is usually not a community that I would drive through after 8 p.m. Because most likely and this is me assuming again, right? I could possibly get pulled over or something like that because these are similar communities that are outside communities from where I live at in the city of Niagara Falls, right? Chatham, in Kent, That's 92% white. And that is a community that's similar to Vermilion, South Dakota, right? I show you all of these landscapes because, again, they play a primary role in constructing the brain architecture of our children, right? And if we don't have access to certain things in our environment, we really have to be intentional about investing in those resources to make sure that our children are exposed to different things. As was mentioned earlier, I have an early childhood learning center known as the Atlantis School for Gifted Youngsters. And my background is early childhood education, so I taught pre-K for some time. And I remember one day I came into class and I was all excited. I had this lesson plan because I was doing this program called Healthy Me. And what the program is I expose my students to healthier food options, things that they may have never really tried before. And I was so excited. I came in one day and I had some ingredients for like guacamole, right? And I'm not sure if you could all relate to this, but a lot of times if something's mushy and green, a lot of times children is like, I'm not going to eat that, right? So I was all excited. I brought it in and I had about 8 students at the time, and a couple of them tried it, but most of them was like, "Ugh, that's nasty, that's nasty." And then a couple that tried it didn't want no more of it because the rest of them was like, "Ugh, that's nasty, that's nasty," right? At that moment, I got an idea. I was like, you know what? Instead of me just bringing something to them and expecting them to try it, I got to make this participatory. So the next time I had an idea of exposing them to something, I made sure that I brought ingredients in and they contributed in the preparation of what it was. So they were like yogurt parfaits, and I used some fruit that they usually wouldn't eat, at home or, in their community. And because they put their hands in it and they were involved in the process, they gave it a chance. Most of them did. Some of them were still like, "Oh, that's nasty." But most of them gave it a chance because they were included in that process, right? And that's something that I learned that was very important in terms of also exposure to cultural enrichment and getting our children in a space where they can learn a little bit more about our human family members that may not live right next door. Creating these opportunities where now they can participate. And one easy pathway to culture is through cuisine, especially if it tastes good, right? Next slide. And I put this here because sometimes people's attitudes is like this, regardless of what I'm talking about. That's how they feel, right? But here's the consequences of that attitude. Next slide. If we are invisible, then our experiences are invisible. And it goes back to what I said initially about ignorance or the ability to just ignore things. And the 2 twin siblings that hang out with ignorance, what was the other 2 that I said? Apathy and indifference, right? Because that sense of invisibility and that lack of care and concern creates these type of circumstances. Next slide. This is one example of what happens when a person has that attitude, right? Next slide. This and this. And this is important because usually having this type of conversation about cultural competence and things being diverse and equitable and accessible and inclusive, when that is not the standard, then usually some people are not at the table. And usually they're not at the table because they are today's special on that menu, right? Lightly seasoned with some chips and a pickle spear on the side.